it's good to have a bigger framework, just so that you see, like, if you don't really have if this life is all that you've got, and there is nothing beyond death, then obviously you need to put all your efforts into keeping this life here going the way you want it to go.
Yeah.
If there's a bigger world beyond this one, then it makes a whole lot more sense to do in this world what is going to be relevant for that bigger world later on.
Yeah. Yep. Definitely.
Yeah. Which is why John wrote his book.
Yeah.
That you may
And
believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life, the bigger life. Yeah.
and the challenge in understanding that bigger picture then is to apply that to whatever circumstances you find in yourself in
Yeah.
this life.
Yep.
How you respond.
Yep.
Whether there's, like what we're talking about, whether there's a pandemic or there's the culture of society is changing, how you respond to any of that,
Yeah.
it comes from the bigger framework. And that's where, what was it? Where's that quote from those guys who they were good at interpreting their times? I can't remember what is it from the Psalms or I can't remember.
Yeah. No, Jesus said, you're good at interpreting the signs. If you see a red sunset, you say it's going to be fine tomorrow. And if you see, I can't remember the details, whatever they are, they're turned around, because he was in the northern hemisphere.
Yeah.
But he says you can't discern the signs of the times. And I guess he was the sign. He was the sign that God's program was moving forward into the next phase for the Jews, from the time when they were under the old covenant that came through Moses and focused upon the law from Sinai and worship in the temple and the nation and the land of Israel. Jesus came to take them the next step, and that's what they were reluctant to do, very reluctant to do.
Well, and that's what this whole end of chapter 11 is all about in John. Because people are grappling with this whole question of who Jesus is and the signs that he's done. And I think we got up to about verse 45.
It's the aftermath of the resurrection of Lazarus.
Yeah, so Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. He calls out, and then he says, loose him, let him go, and you made a comment on that. And then verse 45, now many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary had seen what Jesus did, put their faith in him. And when you mentioned before, when they talk about the Jews, they mean the Jews sort of from Jerusalem who are quite conservative and linked in with the Pharisees. Is that right?
Yeah, well, probably they are the Pharisees.
The Pharisees, yeah.
But they're linked in with the Sadducees in that the Sadducees were the kind of the leading force in the Sanhedrin, in their government.
Yeah.
And the Pharisees had to be in some kind of a relationship with them to influence things that happened in the land. And you see that happening all the way through. The Jews, the high priests and the Pharisees. So the Jews probably represent that force of the sort of the secular-minded Sadducees who ran the high priest or the whole program in the temple, the high priest and his followers, and teamed up with the Pharisees, who were the religious. Mostly the Pharisees were on the side of Jesus, except for the fact that Jesus went too far.
Yeah, so when he cleansed the temple, they probably appreciated that and saw that it was actually something that needed to be done. Lots of other things that he said, but then he keeps going too far.
Well, in the act, yeah, exactly. And even then, it says in that is it Gamaliel? No, it's in the Acts of the Apostles where Gamaliel, who was the leading Pharisee, took the side of the Christians in the Sanhedrin. I think that's right, in chapter 5, when they arrested all the apostles and then decided to let them go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this time we get introduced to Caiaphas, and it seems like there's a response because there was a bunch of Jews who put their faith in Jesus, and there was a bunch of others who went and reported what had happened, as in the raising of Lazarus and what Jesus was saying about himself. They reported that to the Pharisees, and so that gets the chief priests pretty worried, and they convene a meeting of the council. So obviously the council, there was obviously a fair few, as well as being Sadducees in the council, there was also influential Pharisees.
Yeah, well, Nicodemus was a member of the Sanhedrin, and he was leading Pharisee, and so was Joseph of Arimathea.
Yeah.
So there were two of the members of the Sanhedrin who were very sympathetic towards Jesus, prepared to give him a hearing.
So the council meets and they say, if we leave him alone like this, the whole populace will believe in him. Then the Romans will come and sweep away our temple and our nation. It's interesting that that's obviously pretty strong in their thinking. Like they want to stop any sort of revolution. Obviously, they hate the fact that the Romans are in control of them, but they also realize that their power is linked with the power that the Romans have given them and allowed them to have as the rulers of Jerusalem. So, yeah, it's a difficult relationship.
Lucas, I keep thinking of Afghanistan right now and the people who became Christians over the last 20 years when they were allowed to do that. They're not allowed to be Christians any longer. And what do? Do you accommodate yourself to the government? Because that's basically what half of Christianity did, or more than half of Christianity did, when the Byzantine Empire, the eastern half of the Roman Empire, was finally defeated by the Muslims, and then over 200 years, the whole population converted, and that's why we've got the Muslim states all across the north of Africa and in the Middle East.
And they were all strongly Christian before that.
Yeah, that was a Christian empire, the Byzantine Empire. And exactly the same process is now going to be taking place in Afghanistan.
But some people will stay faithful. And
they will. And if enough stay faithful, I think, the same thing happened to the Christians in the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
And that's, that's being repeated again.
Yeah, so in the Roman Empire, there was enough Christians eventually to shift the whole empire.
Yeah.
The emperor and the rulers made favourable policies towards the Christians.
Yeah. And finally became Christians themselves.
What is it? Stark says, I think, that about 30% of the population ended up being Christian.
In Europe?
In the Roman Empire.
In the Roman Empire, yeah.
Yeah, to shift things around. And mostly, he says, most of that happened in the major cities of the empire.
Cities. Yep.
Around the edges of the Mediterranean.
Yeah. Yep.
And they know that because they look at look at the names on the tombstones and the dates, and they can work out what percentage of people were Christian or not. Yeah.
I really love Stark as a sociologist getting evidence before he comes to conclusions about what happened. That's sort of backup evidence. Yeah.
Yep. Anyway, so there's obviously the Sanhedrin can see there's a big issue going on here with Jesus, and that if people keep turning to Jesus, then it threatens their whole position before Rome. Now, Rome come in before and quashed rebellions in Israel? Like they'd done it. There'd
Yeah,
been. Sorry, you go.
very definitely. In Acts chapter 5, it's where it's what Gamaliel said, that there had been a time when there was a rebellion in the name of Judas, and the Romans came and put down that rebellion. I think Josephus says that they crucified all of his followers that they caught uh, along the main roads through the whole of the north of Israel. There would have
In
been an
Galilee.
awful sight. So
What
the
year was that? Do you remember?
AD 6, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's interesting what Gamaliel said was his followers who put their trust in him, in Judas, were all scattered. And I think that word is really important because it's used here in this passage. We haven't got to it yet, but that was God's purpose in sending his son to gather all God's people who were scattered. Yeah.
So then Caiaphas speaks up, who was the high priest that year, and said, you know nothing, whatever. You do not use your judgment. It is more to your interest that one man should die for the people than that the whole nation should be destroyed. He did not say this of his own accord, but as the high priest in office that year, he was prophesying that Jesus would die for the nation, die not for the nation alone, but to gather together the scattered children of God. So from that day on, they plotted his death. Accordingly, Jesus no longer went about publicly in Judea, but left that region for the country bordering on the desert and came to a town called Ephraim, where he stayed with his disciples. So Caiaphas speaks, and in retrospect, John interprets his speech as being prophetic because he was the high priest at the time. Obviously, John had some inside knowledge, some informers that told him all of this. I wonder if they knew later or they knew at the time that this sort of meeting was going on.
Well, I think like Josephus, who helped bury Jesus with Nicodemus, both of them members of the council. So there were sources within the council who could sort of reveal exactly what went on.
You mean Joseph of Arimathea? You said Josephus.
Oh, sorry. Yes, I meant Joseph of Arimathea. Yeah. Incidentally, Josephus was a Pharisee too, and he mentions Christianity favorably, the early disciples and Jesus. Interesting kind of sideline. But yeah, I think what the picture that I get in my mind is here's the Sadducees who are running the whole government. They're the power, the high priests. And then there's the Pharisees. And the Pharisees are doing their best to honour God. They're doing their best within the limits of what they understood from that old covenant and the law and the temple worship that had been prescribed. I think they were genuine. They wanted it to work properly, but they weren't prepared to accept that it was God's intent to move on from there into a new order altogether, and that Jesus was the Son of God sent to actually bring about this, their Messiah. But they were genuine. And so here in this meeting of the Sanhedrin, they're sitting there worrying about what to do. They can see these signs that Jesus had performed were powerful. And it was a real challenge to their previous beliefs, which they were still holding on to. And they could see that the people were being convinced and moving away, and they were determined not to let things change. And obviously there's a self-interest in that, because nobody wants change. It's better to have what you've got rather than risk the future.
Yeah.
So they were very, very definitely led by self-interest, but there was also this concern and this sort of, is he or isn't he? Should we or shouldn't we? What is the result of, what does this really mean if this is all true? And I mean, if I put myself in their place and you see these signs and finally this last one of raising somebody from the dead, you can't ignore somebody like that, and still less can you actually get rid of them.
You can't ignore it, but it challenges their whole belief system.
Yeah.
I mean, if Jesus really is, what is it? The Lord your God is one. That whole challenge to God somehow being one, yet Jesus saying he's the Son of God.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just, it threatens everything. It really cuts to the heart of their belief system.
But in contrast to the Pharisees, who are somehow or rather wrestling with their own consciences about who Jesus is, you have Caiaphas, the high priest, the Sadducee, and for him, there's no question. There's nothing left in him at all. It's a simple matter. Get rid of this bloke. And
Yeah.
that's
It's interesting. His response is interesting because it seems like he's challenging what they've just said, but they're pretty much saying the same thing, aren't they?
Well, yes, they are. In the end, that's the conclusion they both come to.
Like if we leave him alone, the whole world's going to believe in him, then the Romans will come and sweep away our temple. And then Caiaphas, is he saying you're not being hard enough? This needs to go further. We've got to get rid of Jesus.
Well, he's just saying, stop worrying. Don't listen to your conscience.
Okay, just get rid of him.
If you're really going to be a leader in the government, you know what's best, you just do it. And you don't bother about, is he really who he claims to be or not?
Yeah.
It's just so ridiculous. And you see it, I mean, it's not just Caiaphas, but there are so many people now I've met and talked to, intelligent people who they can see that if you take Jesus seriously, it's a huge change that they have to introduce into their own lives. That's what being a Christian is. It's a total reorientation of your life. And even though they've got this sort of, they can't avoid realizing that there's something more there than what they're allowing to come out into their own sort of decision making.
Yeah.
But they're determined to continue with what they've got. Thank you. End of story.
No matter what the signs or the evidence might point to.
Yeah, I don't want to hear any more. Let's just get on with it. And Caiaphas epitomizes that kind of a response to the truth about Jesus. And it's so sad. And the irony of it is that in taking up that attitude, he still couldn't conform to the will of God.
Yeah.
As a high priest, it was his job to prophesy.
Yeah.
He was in charge of the Urim and the Thummim, where you find out the will of God. Anybody wanted to find the will of God, they went to the high priest, and the high priest consulted the Urim and Thummim, which was his breastplate, and was able to know the will of God for the rulers who came and inquired of him. And so that's all in Numbers somewhere or other. And it was, he was doing his job unconsciously.
Yeah.
And I think that's true, you know. There are people who hold that same opinion, same attitude as Caiaphas, but God still uses them to do what is his will, whether they like it or not, whether they're in government or in professions, whether it's the engineer in the Shire who decides to open this park somewhere or other and build it, and it's going to serve God's purposes.
Yeah.
His thinking is purely in terms of this world, but but God still uses those people to whom he delegates authority. And here's a perfect example of it. And it's so ironical that what he says has to happen for political reasons has to happen for God's reasons as well.
Yeah. Yep. And so in John's commentary on all of that, in verse 52, that Jesus would die not for the nation alone, but to gather together the scattered children of God. So from that day on, they plotted his death. So the scattered children of God, is John sort of acknowledging the universal call of Jesus' ministry here? Or is he just talking about the scattered children of God, as in the Jews who are
Yeah,
going to get back together?
I tried my best to work that out, just looking at the Greek, and I couldn't come to a conclusion, because the scattered people of God are the Jews who have been dispersed amongst the nations back by the Babylonians, and yet in chapter 10, remember Jesus said that as the great shepherd, he was going to lead his people.
Yep.
They were going to, he knew them, they were going to follow him. How does it go?
But that they're also sheep not of this fold.
Yeah, and then he went on and said, there are sheep of not of this fold, whom I must also bring.
Yeah.
So,
like with that in the background, you'd think it probably does imply that.
I think so. And I think that's
It's only a chapter ago.
Say again?
It's only a chapter ago.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's almost a continuous flow from back then, chapter 10 into chapter 11. If it is talking about the scattered, like everybody, who are going to trust Jesus and become part of his followers, part of his flock, then the scattering must refer back to the Garden of Eden, where Satan kind of fooled the first human beings into abandoning their relationship and their unity with God and taking notice of him and their own personal desires. And in other words, sin that came in, the original sin that has deformed all of us. So the scattering really is our distancing from God, whether we're Jew or Gentile. And this was part of God's purpose in sending his son into the world to die for us, to bring us all back together into a unity with God.
Which is the ultimate goal.
Yeah. And I wonder too that back to where it's now many of the Jews who'd come to visit Mary, incidentally, that little bit, the Jews who had come to visit Mary, not Martha, but Mary, and they referred to back further in that chapter there where John wrote, the Jews who were in the house condoling with Mary, when they saw her start up and leave the house, went after her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. That John particularly singles out that group of people who somehow or other were drawn to Mary and were her particular friends. And amongst them were, well, most of them probably were people who were in some kind of a relationship with the high priests and the other Pharisees. They were part of the members of the same party, who were also friends of Mary. And it was amongst these that some believed in Christ and others went and told the rest of the Pharisees, and got the trouble started. And that believing in Christ, we talked about it before, but it's something really strong in John's Gospel. that that believing in is more than just believing about. That's really what comes through. That it contains within it not just the credence, just the believing, accepting as a fact, but it's believing with a loyalty and a trust and a commitment and a hope. Yeah, a reliance upon Jesus that somehow or other allows the message about Jesus to come into us, and actively taking part in it puts us into the whole program that Jesus represents, of God bringing the scattered people back to himself.
Yeah.
Making the kind of unity that existed between God, the creator, and the human beings that he created in his image, that unity, restoring that unity that was there at the beginning.
Yeah. I mean, it's the kind of believing that we all know believing should be, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like, we all know that believing should mean that you live consistently in the whole of your life with what you believe. But there's kind of a tradition, especially in our Western society, where you can sort of believe something on one level, but then just go and live completely differently on another level.
Yeah.
But we all know that's hypocritical.
Yeah. And yet it's so accepted as
It
sort
is.
of normal.
Yeah.
We do it in our government, you know. We won't let people, a public figure, we're not supposed to inquire into their personal life, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Doesn't work, because if you had the Minister for Health who turns out to be a wife basher,
Yeah.
essentially the public opinion says, hey, that's not on.
That's right. So at the end here, so Jesus can no longer go about publicly. He knows that he's public enemy now.
Mm.
And so he goes out to the village of Ephraim out in the desert. Is it worth just looking at this last little bit? Verses 55, 57. It just sort of flows on, or is that the next part of the next bit?
Yeah, it sort of sits in between as a transition, I think, from Jesus. It's almost like as though that meeting of the Sanhedrin was Jesus' trial.
Yeah.
At least they'd come to the verdict. He has to die. So whatever happened to get him dead, that was just a simple matter of process. But the judgment was made in the Sanhedrin there when they met to discuss what had happened with the raising of Lazarus from the dead.
Yeah.
And so it's as a transition from the penalty of death having been, or the verdict of death having been given, and then the moving towards that penalty being actually carried out.
Yeah, so the outflow of that is that he's now the public enemy, and that in verse 57, the chief priests and Pharisees had given orders that anyone who knew where Jesus was should give information so that they might arrest him.
Yeah. Not arrest him to take him to trial, arrest him to kill him.
Yeah.
Because that was their decision. It was almost like they had posters up, wanted, not dead or alive, wanted, dead.
But everyone's interested. They're all excited about it because they're thinking, is he going to turn up? Isn't he going to turn up?
Yeah. And
got the people interested.
I couldn't quite get my head around, coming to a conclusion. Their question is, what do you think? Perhaps he's not coming to the festival. It was more curiosity than actually siding with him.
Yeah, isn't it more like we just want a bit of a show here, something exciting to happen?
Yeah.
It's like that kind of thing, I reckon. Not so much we really want to see Jesus the King who we believe in. It's just more we want to see something exciting happen.
And it's not even that we want to see something that will convince us more, and more signs or something like that. But it's they're very, very aware of the tension between the government and Jesus, and they're kind of like going to a boxing match to see who's going to win.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's probably a good place to leave it. Yeah, we'll start back with chapter 12.
Chapter 12. Okay.
Next Friday.
Oh.
We started the Passover, so we're getting towards the end. Although there's still a lot to go.
Time and only halfway through the gospel.
That's right. Yeah, that's true. We are actually halfway. John goes up to chapter 21, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
So we've just passed the halfway mark.
How long's it taken us?
Well, this is like the 39th time we've met.
Amazing.
So another 40 times and we'll be right.
Okay.
Another year.
I appreciate it, Lucas. I really appreciate being made to think slowly over John's gospel.
Yeah, well, thanks for your insights.
Yeah.
We appreciate it a lot. It's great. All right.
See you later.